The Holcim Foundation Awards is proud to partner with The Urbanist on Monocle Radio. The Holcim Foundation Awards is the world's premier competition for sustainable design, highlighting projects that contribute to the transformation of the building sector. Awarding $1 million in prizes, it honours excellence in sustainable design and construction. By showcasing innovative, soon-to-be-realised projects, the awards drive change and inspire a new generation to adopt responsible design practices. Entry for the next awards competition is open now. Find out more, get involved and submit your free entry. Go to holcimfoundation.org/awards. The Holcim Foundation Awards, proud partner of The Urbanist on Monocle Radio.
Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up,
the rivers, the system of the river can be a sort of ideal connection between the different parts from the north and the south part of the city. Also, in terms of joint different projects we are working on.
We're back in Turin for one of our favourite events on the Urbanist calendar, Utopian Hours. This year we sent our man in Milan down the road to bring back some of the most exciting conversations and inspiring ideas from the festival, which wrapped up on October 20th. We explore meanwhile spaces, discuss climate-resilient cities, and attempt to take a trip down the river too, plus plenty more from the Piedmontese capital and beyond. That's all coming up over the next 30 minutes right here on The Urbanist, and I'll hand over now to our very own Ed Stocker, who sent us this report.
We're happy to be here again. This is the 8th edition. We started 7 years ago, actually, being this the 8th. And it was really like a mini festival. It was like a bet. Can we do a festival talking about cities? Is talking about city interesting?
Cool enough?
So we wanted to do it.
Organisers Luca Ballerini and Giacomo Biraghi opening the 2024 edition of Utopian Hours, hosted at Lavazza's Nuvola HQ in the Piedmont capital. Cool enough? Absolutely. What's striking about the festival, which brought together over 30 international speakers this year, is the young crowd that it manages to draw. Turin, over a long weekend in October, is all about urbanism, city making and mobility, and in English. Fun rather than stuffy, going from early afternoon until late evening for those with the stamina. It even has its own snappy jingle. Community has always been key for Ballerini and Biraghi from the organisation Stratosferica, and they treat speakers the same way, getting them together for off-programme events and dinners. Here's New York-based Matt Grunbaum, one of the speakers we'll be hearing from later in the programme, on the atmosphere over the long weekend.
This has been a really cool experience. I mean, last night we had an hour-long conversation on data analysis on nature and data analysis on mobility and how that can actually inform design. So all these conversations happening around the dinner table. So it's really good. I mean, I have to say Utopian Hours have done a great job in bringing a range of voices. It's not all designers, it's not all city policymakers, but it's a mix of everything, and everyone brings something to the table, and it's been very open conversations.
For this week's show, The Urbanist caught up with some of the key speakers over the weekend. First up, we hear from Sarah Castle, architect and co-founder of the If Do practice, based in London and Manchester. She's recently been working on town centre regenerations in Lewisham and Withamshire in the UK, and started off by telling us about how she infuses belonging into her urban projects.
So my starting point today when I was talking about placemaking was really about belonging and thinking about the kind of history of architecture and city making and who's had the power to create cities. It's a really kind of interesting point that us as creatives, us as city makers now have a great deal of power in thinking about that and actually how we share power and create cities that have kind of more of a sense of belonging and feel more for the people that they should be serving. So my talk was actually framing some of our projects through that lens and thinking about the way that we as architects can create spaces for the people that they're serving.
Do you think there is a change taking place? I mean, obviously it's arguably been happening for a while, but is the way we make cities becoming more democratic? Is there more of a conversation, do you think?
I think so. I think, from one perspective, cities becoming more democratic and thinking about the act of kind of co-design and creative collaborations and community engagement in the UK at least has become part of the planning process. So you have to do that as part of your development. And unfortunately, at times that can become a bit of a tick box exercise. So yes, there's a step towards a more democratic process, but I think the best forms of development actually have communities at the heart. And I think, thinking a little bit beyond the realms of who pays the bills to the people who actually are impacted by the structures and spaces that we're creating really should be at the forefront of city making.
IFDU does a lot of different work, a lot of diverse work, but some of what you focused on today was this meanwhile space, temporary usages, I guess reactivating and giving access to buildings or spaces that people didn't have access to before. Maybe you can just talk a bit about that.
Meanwhile projects are really amazing opportunities to test ideas and to bring spaces to life again, and particularly spaces awaiting development. Some of the projects we were talking about really kind of take spaces that could have formed a drag on the high street or a drag on the area by being vacant, particularly some encouraging antisocial behaviour, and finding a use for them that in that short period of time can actually support the communities that they sit within. Hopefully testing uses that could become permanent within future spaces within the city, but at least enabling those communities to find space within the structures that we've been working on. And actually also through the medium of supportive programmes, capacity building programmes actually enable those community members to succeed as areas undergo things like gentrification.
Maybe you can just sort of delve into one of them just to give listeners an example, if you like, of one of these projects.
An example of one of the projects that we were working on actually from quite a while ago was a test project for Lambeth Council with Meanwhile Space CIC. And we took an abandoned porter cabin that used to house a library on Lower Marsh in London and transformed it with very little money into a kind of enterprise hub for local entrepreneurs and startups. It had a shop front, it had a massive smile on the front. So that in answer to the question, how do you make a sad building happy? You make it smile. So we made the building smile, and actually it became a really welcome place. Within the first year, 17 companies had been housed there with a series of programs that enabled them to grow their businesses. And a lot of them, in terms of impact, were reporting really kind of a lot more confidence in terms of growing their business. And that's been a really positive thing as we kind of move forward. In an area that's undergoing rapid change, these people felt really supported.
How do you go about engaging a community? You mentioned one project that was a whopping 15 years in consultation.
Yeah, we love community engagement. I think if you're not listening to the people you're creating buildings from, then there's a mistake happening. It's so unbelievably important. The Observer Building project in Hastings in the south of England is a project we've been working on for 5 years. The first phase is finished and there's many more phases to come. It's a 4,000 square metre former printing press which had been derelict over 30 years. In order to create a kind of community hub within that building, and we were, because our client is a community-led developer who rescued the building, you really had to understand what the community wanted. And I think the real amazing thing about working with a community-led developer like Hastings Commons is that they really stitch in with the community over a long period of time. So it's not a tick box exercise, it's a conversation that keeps happening. And with grant funding and the very many funding pots that you need for a project like that, it enables the brief to constantly evolve. So you can't just do community engagement at the beginning and say, this is the fixed brief, because if a building is in process for 15 years, you need to keep on talking because needs and aspirations evolve and change.
IFDU's Sarah Castle. Our next speaker, Yes We Camp's Marseille-based founder Nicolas Detry, also focuses on meanwhile spaces, what he calls large-scale common spaces. Some may call his vision utopian, but he's convinced that he can make the world a better place through his interventions. And he's okay not getting rich doing it. So what exactly is Yes We Camp?
Yes, we Camp is a group of persons. We are a collective organization, 120 members, dedicated to creating large-scale common spaces. Independent, not for profit, rather young and feminine.
You said in your talk that it was about creating common spaces that are less about money. But there's always money involved somewhere, isn't there? Is it easy to sort of avoid the money part?
The economic model is always a big question. We want to escape from consumer society, so we want to invent something that is different from the conventional life that we are, all of us, experiencing every day. So we are a kind of laboratory where we try to create different conditions. And in these different conditions, money is less important. We organize so that anyone can take part, can feel legitimate, even if you are out of money. So what is important is more the time that you're able to share, to give, to co-productions of what we need for a place to be a good place to be.
I mean, you've activated lots of spaces around France, Marseille, Paris, but also villages. You were saying in your talk about a shop that you helped revitalize in a southern French village, and then someone took over the rent. What's the message here? That there's a lot of space that's underused. Space can bring communities together, let people have a go at sort of creating space when it's not being used. What's the overarching, if you like, message?
We need to invent a new future. Another organization, another socio-economic organization, because the one that we have now is eating the planet, and so we need to adapt and change. So we consider ourselves as demonstrators, like in real life, of possibilities of an alternative to consumer society. So we use vacant spaces that we get for free, and then we invent kind of mini worlds that can be a testimony for all of us, a proof of the possibility to organize ourselves differently. And so this is why we try to take on our sites all the complexities of today's world, poor people, migrant people, the question of resources, of buildings that we need to adapt in a frugal way rather than demolish and rebuild. So we are this kind of laboratory of togetherness.
Is it amazing sort of seeing some of the stories that develop and the way people react to your projects?
We also always have good surprises about neighbors or people that were skeptical about the projects. And in the end, there is a kind of magic, or I don't know if it's magic, but a process that exists among elements of the human tribes. And when we connect, what we witness is that feeling of happiness. We thrive, we flourish in this connection and in taking part to produce meals, to produce events, to produce social help. We have good surprises.
Would you like somehow for this to become permanent, at least in one space?
Yeah, we want projects to be permanent. We are long-term actors. We are dedicated to systemic change, so we are looking at upcoming decades. But the idea today is to create also financial capacities or maybe new organizations that would be able to take the ground, the property, so that what we create in one place can last not only as a testimony, but also on this very place that we activated. We are aware of the risk to be used by developers to create attractivity and identity to a place. We are aware of it, and we do not work with developers. The quasi-totality of our owners are public or para-public entities. But even with public or para-public entities, there is this struggle about not being used, but it's a bit of a judo, because we want to make the proof of the possibility of our vision of society. And we win when the owner decides to keep all the uses that we revealed in the future project that they want to create.
And that happens a lot?
That happens a lot.
Nicolas Detry from Yes We Camp. Our next guest doesn't deal in temporary spaces, but he may never have known that the former warehouse complex he bought in an unsightly part of town would become such a permanent fixture in Estonian capital, Tallinn. Teleskivy Creative City includes cafes, restaurants, music, office space, theatre and more. It has become a model for others to follow because it has managed to keep strong, clear values. Here's its founder and CEO, Janus Jus.
We actually went often to Berlin, ran the Berlin Marathon, and there's a lot of old squatted buildings in the middle of Berlin. We hanged out in one of these squatted buildings on Orangenburger Straße, And it just looked such a wild environment full of cannabis smoke, musicians, drunk people and everything. They all seemed so happy. And so we started thinking that maybe it's possible to create a similar environment, but on a more sustainable business model so that it's not squatted, but we actually build it out from ground up so that it is sustainable and can last decades. And then, so that's where the initial push came. And then we started looking for a property where we can actually make that.
And this was 17 years ago, roughly, wasn't it? And then you found a place straight away and you were like, let's go for it. I mean, you didn't have any experience of doing something like this?
No, I think nobody had experience in doing something like this. But I managed a private equity fund that bought this property to demolish it and build new housing. And then the fund ended, the property went to sale, and then I left the fund and tried to buy the property, and we started this project.
I think you were saying before we recorded that actually there was a lot of interest. Because I asked you, I said, look, did you get a good price for it? Because back then the area wasn't developed. It had been a sort of railway yard. It had also been a factory under Soviet times. But then you said, no, actually, we had to outbid all the real estate people, many of whom wanted to just knock it down.
Yeah, there was quite a lot of interest. We still have to keep in mind that it was only 300, 400 meters from the government buildings and the old town. It was very centrally located. It was just at that time, not in a good area. But the other developers obviously saw the potential for new housing or office buildings, and so that's what we had to bid against.
I'm interested in the model because obviously it's very successful. It was maybe difficult at the beginning, but you're doing well financially. There's a long list of people who want to be part of it. How do you, in a way, you talked about what you'd seen in Berlin, the sort of creative, free area. How do you sort of stay true to your roots as you become more successful, as brands want to get involved? In your talk, you talked about the way you support fragile but worthy causes. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
When we are already strong enough financially that all our immediate needs are covered, then turning really meaningfully towards culture and the creative industry is just so much more rewarding than doing anything with a brand. And you actually get a kind of a kick out of sending another brand down the road and then not doing anything with them and then really focus on the fragile but worthy. It's a hell of a drug.
Last question. You mentioned right at the end of your talk that you're focusing very much on what's next, the expansion of this concept, creating a network of creative cities outside of Tallinn. Where could be next for you? And how do you sort of export, I guess, those values that you've created in Tallinn?
We are talking with a lot of cities, I think 6 or 7 around Europe, and most of these cities have turned to us with a clear invitation that we would like to have something like this. Obviously, as we operate independently, we need to still make our own way into the city, find the right properties, find the right sellers, figure out if we can actually do what we want to do from the city planning perspective and then all the local regulations. It is as soon as possible. I'd be happy to kick some bricks around next week if needed. So the whole focus is on expanding. But we know how to build up a creative city. We know how to talk to the culture industry, the creative industry. But obviously we will do it together with the locals. It's not the circus that we bring to town from Tallinn and entertain everybody. It's a really meaningful bottom-up development with the local community. So we need locals involved anyway.
Teleskivi Creative Cities, Janus Jus. Let's stay in Turin for a moment because Utopian Hours is also a chance to shine a spotlight on what's happening in the Piedmont capital. Every year it takes speakers to see a new part of the city. This year a boat tour to see a new river centre had been scheduled before the weather decided to intervene. Here's my report.
You may be able to hear that it's raining a little bit on this Sunday morning in Turin. We were meant to be going down the River Po this morning to discover the new river centre, but the rainfall and the high levels of the river mean it's been cancelled. But that's not going to stop us. We're still going to go and actually see the site and talk to all the key people involved.
First stop of the guided tour in London.
The weather may be decidedly, British, but that's not enough to stop us heading down to the Po River, hosted by Stratospherica's Giacomo Beraghi, cracking the rain joke, and Luca Berardini. Alongside the city-making talks, one of the standouts of Utopian Hours is the way it gets speakers together to see how it all happens in practice. This year, the Turin River Experience.
Back then, the river was not as wide as it is today. especially today, which is very wide.
No boat perhaps, but we can still get an idea of both the way the city is connected to nature and the ambitious city-making plans it has to bring the river to the fore. And when it comes to the latter, it's all about a new river centre. Here's Carlo Ratti Associates' Luca Bussolino, Head of Strategy and Innovation at the firm designing the project, for some context.
So the River Center is a space for encounter, first and foremost. It's in a historic warehouse next to the River Po. The warehouses closed down in 2012 and they are now reopening. Most of them are cafes and restaurants and nightlife places. And our intervention is focused on 7 warehouses. They used to be silk warehouses in the 19th century, and now they become a space for encounter and for the city. There will be a space for a research innovation center for university and polytechnic. And together with that, there will be a space open for the city and the citizens. You can discover the river. You can just walk there. It's a public space. It's a public piazza next to the river.
We walk along the river with our 2 guides heading towards the site for the new centre, set to open in 2026. There to meet us, taking cover under an umbrella, is City Councillor Francesco Tresso, in charge of city upkeep. He clearly views the river as central to Turin's future.
I think that, in fact, the city is not using enough the river system. Nowadays, I think that we are also carrying out a sort of master plan of the rivers, because in terms of master plan, the rivers, the system of the river, can be a sort of ideal connection between the different parts from the north and the south part of the city. Also, in terms of joint different projects we are working on.
But what of the building itself? Nicoletta Mazzovilla, senior architect at Carlo Ratti, is on hand to show us more. And even though it's covered in fencing, we can still get a peek.
Should we go up the steps here? So obviously this river centre is an existing building. You're obviously not rebuilding it, but you're sort of gutting the interior. Maybe tell me about the transformation that's going to happen to this building that currently is the sort of shell. It's got the graffiti. Got some nice skeleton graffiti on our left.
We will leave it, the graffiti here, actually.
You're going to leave it?
Yeah, we're going to leave it because it's...
Interesting.
It's the history of this place. We demolish everything and we bring, as you can see now, we can bring back the wall bricks, the walls that are really magnificent. Also, we start to make a design of the furniture that will recall some elements of the river, has the boats. So the furniture has a boat shape.
The firm is also building a set of piers along the river, including a stop outside the centre for 2 new electric boats that will take tourists and curious locals down the river, all part of its steady transformation. As for one day taking a dip in the Po, one step at a time. One of those on the river trip was New York-based Australian Matt Grunbaum, an associate partner at Field Operations, the landscape architecture and urban design firm behind the Big Apple's High Line, among many other projects. We catch up with him after speaking at his first Utopian Hours to talk public realm.
I think a great public realm is a public realm that actually connects places within cities and gives space for people and for multiple uses to happen there. I also think with good public realm design, it is true of place. So it really takes from either the history of place, the culture of place, the community of place, to make sure it feels a little bit authentic to where it is designed in and where it's used in.
So you always try and do that? Is research a big thing when you go to a new place? How do you go about sort of reflecting where it is? Is it the same sort of recipe every time, or does it vary?
No, it definitely varies. And I think the beauty of landscape architecture and public realm and cities is that they're all very different. Even, within a city like New York City, designing in Brooklyn is very different to designing in Manhattan, to designing in Staten Island, designing on the waterfront versus designing a park. And every place has a very different history, sometimes have very different communities or variety of community groups. So being able to tap into all of those aspects to help inform us on how to actually approach the design.
Your firm is known, amongst other things, for the High Line, which everyone talks about the whole time. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is that annoying? That's the sort of eternal association is the High Line?
Look, it's actually a great project to be associated with. I mean, it's been very beneficial for our firm to have a project that's been that successful and that is pointed to that much. It's been the catalyst for us getting other great projects as well. And I think, as we've grown as a firm for well over 25 years, we've been able to execute and deliver other projects that are of as significant, I believe, and as of a big scale. We just delivered Seattle Waterfront. We opened up the Overlook Walk, I think, 2 weeks ago. We've done other projects like Tongva Park. So we've been able to do a lot of big-scale projects, similar scale and similar importance, I believe, to the High Line and what the High Line's been for New York. So, yeah, I do love that project. I do think it has some importance in our firm, but it's been a catalyst for us getting other projects at the same scale and leverage.
Tell us about the Santa Monica project you worked on that you referenced in your speech.
That project is very dear to my heart. It was the first project I got to work on at Field Operations. We started it back in 2009, and I got to move out to Los Angeles and oversee the construction of it. And, made some longtime friends at the city of Santa Monica and with the contractors and other consultants. But, more so, we managed to turn an empty parking lot, a 6-acre parking lot, into quite a dynamic park space that's really even more than just a park. It's a very immersive garden. It's something that's that dynamic in the city. It's very hard to execute. I think it's been a great addition to Santa Monica in terms of being able to connect through from downtown Santa Monica to the local neighborhoods as well.
Another thing that came up during Utopian Hours was, I think it was Giacomo who said that he thought the public realm in the US was ahead in many ways. A lot of cities, New York included, are quite good at these sort of little interventions, conversions, pocket parks, etc. Do you think the US is ahead in that sense?
I think we all look to each other in a weird way. It's interesting you mention pocket parks and small interventions, and just when we walk around Turin, we walk around these amazing squares and plazas and streets and arcades and paseos, and that is very different in texture and tone to the US. And I think I look at that and I'm like, okay, I want to bring some of that character and tone back to the US. So I think we all look to each other, and I think there is a little bit of the grass is always greener, but I think cities looking to each other on how to improve the public realm is always a good thing. I think financing the public realm, like how does it get built, how does it get maintained and managed, is a big thing. And in that sense, I think the US may be a little bit ahead, or at least does it very differently. Just the notion of philanthropy and donations, conservancies and things like that, which doesn't seem as prevalent as here in Italy or even what we see in the UK.
Matt Grunbaum there. Our last interviewee on today's show is landscape architect Kochakon Vodakom from Bangkok. Like many people appearing at Utopian Hours, climate change was a dominant theme, and she's made it central to her work. She looks at ways to make the Thai capital more resilient through her practice Land Process and heading up the Porous City Network. She tells Monocle about nature-centric solutions.
I feel that there are so many physical built environment professions that put humans as a centric of all development. But I feel that having a landscape architect in the conversation, I think we can help balance out the solution that will lean toward putting climate and nature as a concept. We need to work together.
I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? You're talking about the built environment, you're talking about finding solutions, and obviously landscape architects are people who help come up with those solutions, or at least build them in a certain regard. One of the things that struck me from your talk was the fact that you said you were the first landscape architect invited to COP, the climate change shindig. Was that surprising to you, that there are politicians, there are change makers, in inverted commas, present, but no one from landscape architecture?
Well, that was COP26 in Glasgow. And it's actually shifting me as a person, because I thought I'm so busy working on my things in my little corner of the world, but really see the whole big picture of how the world fixing climate. I feel that, wow, it's such a different system. It's such a different conversation. It's such a different vocabulary. And we have to come and make decisions together as nations with an S. And how can we figure out things? And I feel that for me, I was surprised as the first official landscape to be invited to that conference. And it's COP26. So you can imagine they have already 26 years talking about climate change without us. And I think that we need more seat on the table. Not only just the profession, but also the city solution And adaptation, we need to work in par with mitigations and loss and damage. And I think there's so many other things that we can contribute in that critical decision.
I want to talk about your projects in a second, but I wanted to know, are you ever frustrated because you are such an advocate for climate change and solutions to climate change? Are you frustrated that there is a lot of talk and not a lot of action?
I'm human, so frustration is probably a very basic thing. But I feel that how can we shift that kind of energy, that frustration, into become an action? And I know that for COP, it's like we try to fix climate through policy, through wording, through language. But in reality, the real work is actually outside from that conference. The real work is actually for all the people on this planet. The real work is those who are vulnerable to all this impact, flooding, urban heat, drought, and, like many more to come. My tool is nature, and my tool is design with nature, working with nature. And I think this is a very critical message that we need to convey to all scale solutions.
Let's talk about some of your projects in Thailand. You've done a park, you've done what I believe is the second biggest rooftop farm in the continent. There's a new government project. Tell us about them and how you cleverly deal with things like rainfall and runoff and collection as well of water.
I feel it's more like a design strategy, how we're going to tackle city problems. Like how can we shift the park into retention park and detention areas for the city. If we want to figure out the waste space in the rooftop, which is like tremendous areas equal to the cities that been unused, how can we fix those kind of areas to give benefits? Because for adaptation, we kind of just build the city from the scratch. We have to adapt what we have and work with it.
Kochakorn Vodacom there. Inspiring speakers from different corners of the globe, intent on making better, more just, greener places for us all to live in. Now that's a message we can get behind. For Monocle in Turin, I'm Ed Stocker.
Thank you, Ed. And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. Remember, you can get new editions of the show every week. Just follow us through your favourite podcast provider. You can also subscribe to Monocle magazine for regular reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism. Just visit monocle.com. This episode of The Urbanist was produced by Ed Stocker, Carla Trebello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye. Thanks for listening, city lovers.